New kind of interesting fantasy world? Check. Generic characters? Check. Weakish production value? Check. Incredibly cringy and uninteresting dialogue? Check. Yep, it's a Netflix adaptation of a fantasy book. Hey guys, welcome back to Adlib Talk, and this is my review for Shadow and Bone. But before we start with the review, don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing. Those are the two main ways you can help support my channel here on Adlib Talk. Cheers, and let's get right into that review. So Shadow and Bone is a new 8-episode fantasy series that is based on a trilogy of books with the same name. As a fantasy world, there are many familiar elements here. You have characters that can control the Earth's elements, for example, whether it's fire or wind. There are some who can control people's hearts, for example, or heal people's injuries. Then you've obviously got the chosen one, right? Who happens to be a commoner who still had sort of no idea that they had any kind of powers. The necessary love triangle that you get with any female protagonist in a fantasy story, and a dark-haired toxic villain who sort of tries to seduce our hero. Yes, as you can tell, it is tropey as hell. And if you think these things will put you off, you can stop the video right here. You're not going to enjoy this series. But at its heart, Shadow and Bone is not a poorly made series. It has a lot of positive messages, and whilst there are some pretty poor elements to it, it is an enjoyable watch, and I think it is quite well worth your time. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this review. One of my favorite elements of this series is its setting. I love how this isn't your classic fantasy based on the sort of English dark Middle Ages. The Kingdom of Ravka is based on Tsarist Russia. Now, this adds a layer of diversity that is much welcome. Anything to break all those dark fantasy tropes present here. This war-torn world is divided with the Shadowfold, which is a kind of magical darkness that separates the east and west of Ravka and is inhabited by these dangerous winged creatures called the Volcra. So the story here is that Alina Starkov is a map maker, but with time we obviously start to discover that she is actually a Grisha. Now in this world, the Grisha are kind of like witches who practice what is called in this world the small science. There are many different types of Grisha, with each type being able to manipulate some kind of element, as I mentioned at the start of this review. In Ravka, kids are tested at a young age by Grisha examiners, who would then send kids who sort of demonstrate they have some kind of power to the little palace where they get to train. Now, Alina Starkov had managed to avoid the test, which is why no one ever knew she had this kind of power in the first place. However, when Alina's best friend Mal is chosen to be a part of a team to cross the Shadowfold, she decides to burn some maps, and so as to be forced to travel with him. On their way through the Shadowfold, what happens? Obviously, they are attacked by the Volcra, and in the process of being taken by these Volcra, Alina uses an ancient power taught only to be a myth, the sun summoning. This destroys the Volcra and saves the crew. However, it also obviously catches the attention of General Kerrigan, who takes her to prove her abilities to the king and queen of Ravka. In the meantime, the other major plot point in the story is that of gang leader Cass Brecker and his two gang members Inesh and Jesper. They live in the city of Ketterdam and find out that a merchant named Dressen has a job with a payout of around 1 million Kruge. After battling it out with Pekka Rollins, who is a crime boss, he gets the job, which is that of capturing this same sun summoner, Alina Starkov. All of this basically takes place in the first episode. So as you can tell, it's quite a hectic one with a lot of world building going on and story taking place. It does throw quite a few names at you, names of characters, names of cities, kingdoms, and so on. And sometimes I do get the feeling it assumes you kind of know these things a little. However, to be honest, after the first episode, I did feel quite confident that I had a decent grasp of who was who and sort of which kingdom or city was which. But I could have done with a bit more maps to help me sort of picture the world better rather than having to go online and search for them myself. This, however, shows more or less that the world building is done quite well. Not excellently, like in something like, for example, The Witcher, or in something like Game of Thrones, for example, but still quite decent. Visually, all these different areas of Ravka look quite similar, to be honest, and I have a feeling that the show writers struggled with sort of this aspect of sort of the production value quite a bit. It costs a lot of money to create a series like this. On the other hand, the characters do need some work. Most of these characters feel quite generic and underwritten, and I think this was one of the most disappointing aspects of this series. If I had to ask you to describe Alina Starkov, would you actually be able to tell me anything about her? Sort of, she's serious, she's the chosen one, but really, she never really shows any kind of character from beginning to end, basically. What about her best friend Mal? He is loyal, he is also quite serious, and, there's nothing much there. Probably the two most interesting characters in this series are Inesh and Jesper. Jesper provides some of the little humor present in this series. To be honest, it is far too serious. And although much of his humor does not work, it's more miss than hit here, to be honest. He still offers a breath of fresh air. Inesh's developments are also quite interesting. She's clearly an incredibly talented assassin, but she seems to not want to kill. The religious aspect of her life also adds some depth to her character, and we see some changes in Inesh's character, which make her one of the more complex characters here. This meant that I was always looking forward to Jesper and Inesh's scenes with their gang leader, Cass. And that part of the story, to be honest, is much more interesting than the sort of coming of age story we have for Alina. Our antagonist, General Kerrigan, is predictably evil, seems to be the sort of typical toxic male, but at the same time he tries to sort of justify his evil methods behind obvious lies and deceit. We've seen it 100 times, but the performances here are not horrible, to be perfectly honest. So I don't mind General Kerrigan at all. The series is also not good enough to jump between one plotline and another without losing the attention of the watcher. It also unfortunately adds some other quite bland subplots, such as one with this Grisha Nina Zelek, in which he ends up as a slave, but then sort of falls in love with her Fjord slaver, who also falls in love with her or doesn't. I don't know. It almost had me switching off the TV, to be honest. That part of the series was extremely weak, especially the dialogue. The dialogue is horrible. Yes, overall, the dialogue in this series is nothing to write home about. Most of the time, it was okay, sometimes a bit too Charles Dickens-like when it comes to these sort of Cass, Inesh, and Jesper scenes. Sometimes a bit too cringy. The romance in this series is especially quite poor, but it then improves greatly in other scenes, such as, for example, when we have a lot of world building. That is where the writing really shines. So it's like a tale of two cities here. On one hand, we've got some pretty decent writing, on the other hand, some pretty cringy and poor writing. And this, however, leads me to one of the positives of this series. The whole narrative takes place in a very brisk manner. There are very, very few slow moments here. When the world building is taking place, it is all done in a rather interesting manner, and it always still manages to push the narrative effectively. This is clearly seen in the first episode that I described at the start of this review. As you may have seen from my summary, a lot of things happened in the first 15 minutes of this TV series. All the while, the series is also successfully building this new fantasy world for book readers and series watchers alike. So that aspect of this series was done quite well. Still, unfortunately, the world itself, as I was saying in the beginning, is not interesting enough to sort of make this an extremely positive aspect, but still, the writing and the overall plotline works decently and works well with the world building we have here. To conclude, Shadow and Bones is a perfectly enjoyable fantasy series you can pass the time with. I do have a feeling though that this series holds a lot more potential than that which we have seen so far. Compared to something like The Witcher, for example, the production value feels quite inferior. The world is not as expansive and the characters just are not fleshed out at all. I do hope Netflix invest more time and money into this series. However, as I would especially love to continue seeing Inesh, Jesper and Cass's swashbuckling adventures across Ravka. On the other hand, most definitely a lot of work has to go into Elena Starkov's character, who was incredibly bland in the first season. This leads me to the score. For its first season, I will give Shadow and Bone a 2.5 out of 5. Watch it if you pretty much have nothing to watch and enjoy fantasy series. If you're not a fan of these typical Netflix fantasy series, avoid it. You're not going to enjoy it. That's the end of the review, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please don't forget to leave a like on this video and do consider subscribing for more TV series, movies, and video game reviews. Cheers, and I'll see you guys next time right here on Adlib Talk.